A noblewoman stood on the deck of a warship, her hands stained with blood, watching French vessels burn on the horizon. Jeanne de Clisson had lost everything to a king's betrayal. Now, she commanded a fleet painted black with crimson sails, a ghost on the water, hunting royal ships across the Atlantic. They called her the Lioness. But what they didn't know was how far a mother's rage could reach. Brittany. 1300. The kind of place where stone castles grew from cliffs like teeth, where the Atlantic crashed against rocks that had stood for 1,000 years. Jeanne Louise de Belleville was born into this world, a world of titles, land, and carefully arranged marriages. Her family wasn't royal, but they were close enough to taste it. Nobles, landowners, people who knew how to survive the endless chess game of medieval French politics. She was 12 when she married her first husband. 12. That wasn't unusual. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances, about merging estates, about survival. Her first husband died young. She was 14 when she became a widow for the first time. Still a child, really. But in 14th century France, childhood ended the moment you could be useful. Her second marriage came quickly. Olivier de Clisson I, a man of power, of influence, of military skill. He was a knight, a warrior, someone who understood the brutal calculus of the 100 Years' War, the endless conflict between England and France that had turned entire regions into graveyards. Olivier was pragmatic. He switched sides when it suited him, pledging loyalty to the English crown when the French seemed weak, then back again when the wind changed. That was how you survived. Loyalty was a luxury. Survival was an art. Jeanne bore him children. 5 of them. She managed estates, oversaw harvests, negotiated with merchants and priests and minor lords. She was good at it, better than most men, if the records are honest. But history doesn't care much about women who manage estates. It cares about women who break the rules. For years, her life followed the expected script. Castle walls, feast days, births and deaths, and the slow, grinding rhythm of medieval existence. She wasn't unhappy. Happiness wasn't really the goal. Stability was, security, a future for her children. She had that, for a while. But France, during the 100 Years' War, was a place where nothing stayed stable for long. The English wanted the French throne. The French wanted the English gone. And in between, nobles, like Olivier de Clisson, played both sides, trying to read the future in the movements of armies and the promises of kings. Jeanne watched it all. She listened to her husband's war stories, to the reports of battles fought in fields she'd never see, of men dying for causes they barely understood. She learned the language of power, the way it shifted, the way it consumed, the way it rewarded some and destroyed others with no logic, no justice, only appetite. She had everything a noblewoman could want. But in France, during the 100 Years' War, everything could vanish in a single accusation. The year was 1343. Olivier de Clisson had just fought in the War of the Breton Succession. A messy, brutal conflict over who would control Brittany. It was the kind of war where allegiances shifted daily, where today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, depending on who paid more, who threatened louder, who promised better lands. Olivier had fought for the French. At least, that's what he claimed. But King Philip VI didn't believe him. Or maybe Philip did believe him, and simply didn't care. Kings don't need truth. They need examples. Someone whispered in the king's ear. Maybe a rival noble, maybe an English spy, maybe just a rumour, the kind that spreads like infection in royal courts. The whisper said, Olivier de Clisson is planning to betray France. He's negotiating with the English. He's going to open the gates of Breton castles and let the enemy in. It didn't matter if it was true. In medieval France, accusation and guilt were often the same thing. Olivier was summoned to Paris. Not a request, a command. Jeanne must have known what that meant. When a king summons a noble to Paris during wartime, it's rarely for a feast. But what could she do? Refuse? Run? That would only confirm the accusation. So Olivier went, and Jeanne stayed behind, surrounded by her children, her estates, her carefully built life, waiting. The trial, if you could call it that, was held in secret. No witnesses for the defense. No evidence presented beyond hearsay and suspicion. Olivier de Clisson was found guilty of treason. The sentence, death, but not just death, public execution. In Paris, in front of a crowd, because the king wanted everyone to see what happened to traitors, real or imagined. Jeanne didn't attend the trial. Women weren't allowed. She waited at home, pacing the stone floors of her castle, staring at the horizon, wondering if her husband would return. She must have known deep down that he wouldn't. You don't summon a man to Paris and send him home with an apology. The news reached her days later. Not from the king, not from any official messenger, from travelers, from merchants, from whispers carried along trade routes, like disease. Olivier de Clisson had been beheaded, his body displayed, his head mounted on a pike at the gates of Paris. A warning, a spectacle, a message written in flesh and bone. The king called it treason. Olivier called it lies. But in medieval France, the truth didn't matter. Only power did. Paris, 3043. A crowd gathered in the square where executions were held. Public death was entertainment in medieval France. A break from the grinding monotony of survival. People brought their children. Vendors sold bread and ale. It was a festival of horror. Olivier de Clisson knelt. His hands were bound, his neck exposed. The executioner raised the axe. One swing, then another. Medieval executions weren't always clean. Sometimes it took multiple blows. Sometimes the condemned screamed. Sometimes they prayed. History doesn't record what Olivier said, if he said anything at all. Maybe he was silent. Maybe he cursed the king. Maybe he thought of his wife, his children, the life he was about to lose. The axe fell. The crowd cheered. His head was severed, lifted, displayed. Blood ran into the cobblestones. The executioner held the head high, turning it so everyone could see the face of a traitor. But the king wasn't finished. Olivier's body was left on public display for days. His head was mounted on a pike at one of the city gates, a warning to anyone passing through. This is what happens to traitors. This is what happens when you defy the crown. It didn't matter if you were guilty. It didn't matter if you were innocent. What mattered was the message. Jeanne heard about it in pieces. A traveller told her Olivier had been arrested. Then another said he'd been executed. Then a third described how his head was on display in Paris, rotting in the sun, picked at by crows. She didn't see it happen, but she saw it anyway. In her mind, in her dreams. In the way her children asked where their father was and she had no answer that didn't sound like a scream. Medieval justice wasn't about fairness. It was about power. And power in 14th century France meant making examples of people. Olivier de Clisson became an example. A cautionary tale, a name whispered in fear. But the king made a mistake. He thought killing Olivier would end the problem. He thought a widow would mourn quietly, remarry, fade into obscurity. He thought wrong, because Jeanne de Clisson didn't fade. She didn't remarry immediately. She didn't retreat into silence. Instead, something inside her shifted. Grief has a way of transforming into something sharper, something colder, something that doesn't forgive. They didn't just kill him. They made a spectacle of it. And in doing so, they created something far more dangerous than a widow. Jeanne stood in her castle, surrounded by lands she no longer wanted, by titles that meant nothing, by a life that had been built on sand. Everything she'd worked for, the alliances, the careful politics, the compromises, had been destroyed by a king's whim. She could have remarried. That's what widows did. Find another noble. Merge estates, continue the game. She had offers. Men who saw opportunity in her grief, who wanted her lands, her connections, her body. She refused them all. She could have entered a convent. That was another option. Become a nun. Dedicate her life to God. Spend her days in prayer and silence. Some widows found peace that way. Jeanne wasn't interested in peace. She could have accepted her loss, mourned quietly, raised her children, faded into history as just another noble woman who suffered and survived. But suffering wasn't enough. Survival wasn't enough. Jeanne de Clisson wanted revenge. But revenge in 14th century France wasn't simple. She couldn't challenge the king in court. He was the court. She couldn't raise an army. She was a woman, and women didn't lead armies. She couldn't appeal to the church. The church served the crown. So she did something no one expected. She liquidated everything. Her estates, her jewels, her furniture, her her land. She sold it all, piece by piece, castle by castle. She turned her entire life into gold, into currency, into fuel for something darker. Her children were sent away, to relatives, to safe places, away from what she was about to become. Some historians say she did it to protect them. Others say she did it because she knew she was about to step into a world where children were liabilities, where love was weakness, where the only thing that mattered was vengeance. She hired mercenaries, sailors, soldiers, men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, men who didn't care about honor or loyalty, only payment. She bought ships, not trade vessels, warships, and she had them painted black, black hulls, black sails, the color of mourning, the color of death. Later, she would add crimson, the color of blood. But first, black, a fleet born from grief, sailing toward the king's ships like a storm made flesh. Most widows mourned. Jeanne de Clisson liquidated her entire fortune and prepared for war. The Atlantic, 3043, 3 ships, not large by naval standards, but fast, maneuverable, built for hunting, not for carrying cargo. Jeanne had them painted black from hull to mast. Every plank, every rope, black, the color of death, the color of the void, and then, to make sure no one misunderstood, she added crimson sails, red, blood red. The kind of red that looked like someone had dipped canvas in gore and hung it to dry. It wasn't practical. It wasn't subtle. It was a message. Medieval warfare was full of symbols. Knights wore specific colors to represent their houses. Banners carried family crests. Heraldry mattered. It told you who you were fighting, who you served, what you stood for. Jeanne's ships carried no crest, no noble symbol, just black and red, death and blood. Nothing else. She recruited a crew, not noblemen, not knights, pirates, mercenaries, outcasts, men who had been excommunicated, exiled, or simply forgotten, men who didn't care about God or king, only about survival and payment. Jeanne paid well, and she promised something even better than gold, revenge. They called themselves the Black Fleet. Some of them had fought in the 100 Years' War, some had been sailors, some had been criminals. It didn't matter. On Jeanne's ships, the past didn't exist. Only the mission. Only the hunt. Jeanne didn't just fund the fleet. She commanded it. She stood on the deck, dressed in black, her hair tied back, her hands on the wheel. She learned navigation. She learned naval tactics. She learned how to read the wind, the tides, the movements of enemy ships. She wasn't playing at war. She was preparing to win. The psychology of fear is simple. People fear what they don't understand. A black ship, with red sails, appearing out of fog or darkness, was something nightmares were made of. French sailors began to whisper about it. A ghost ship, a demon ship, a ship commanded by a woman who had sold her soul for vengeance. They weren't entirely wrong. Jeanne's target was specific. French ships, merchant vessels, supply ships, anything flying the French royal banner, anything that served King Philip VI. She didn't care about treasure. She didn't care about trade routes. She cared about blood. Her first hunt began in the waters off Brittany. French ships traveled these routes regularly, carrying supplies, soldiers, messages between ports. They were vulnerable, slow, unprepared for an enemy that didn't follow the rules of chivalry. Black hulls, crimson sails. A fleet born from vengeance, sailing toward the king's ships like a storm made flesh. The French merchant ship didn't see them coming. Fog rolled across the water like a blanket, thick and grey. Visibility was almost zero. The crew was relaxed. This was a routine voyage, carrying grain and wine from Brittany to Paris. No pirates this close to shore, no threats, just the slow, steady rhythm of rowing and wind. Then the fog parted, and there, less than 50 meters away, was a ship. Black hull, crimson sails, silent, like something that had risen from the ocean floor. The French crew panicked. They tried to turn, to flee, but it was too late. Jeanne's ship was faster. Her crew was ready. They closed the distance in minutes. Grappling hooks flew. Ropes pulled the two vessels together, and then the boarding began. Medieval naval combat wasn't like the movies. It wasn't clean. It wasn't elegant, it was chaos. Swords, axes, close quarters brutality, the smell of blood and salt water, screaming, men falling overboard, drowning in armor, men stabbing, slashing, fighting for their lives on slippery decks. Jeanne's crew was ruthless. They overwhelmed the French sailors quickly. Most of the crew surrendered, but surrender didn't mean safety. Jeanne stepped onto the captured ship. Witnesses later claimed she was calm, almost serene. Like she was walking through her own castle. Not a blood-soaked deck. She surveyed the captured crew, sailors, merchants, and 3 French nobles, traveling under the king's protection. The nobles begged. They offered ransom. They invoked God, the king, the law. Jeanne listened. Then she ordered them executed. Not quickly, not mercifully. She wanted them to know why they were dying. Because they served the king who murdered her husband. Because they flew his banner. Because they were part of the system that destroyed her life. Some accounts say she killed them herself. Others say she ordered her crew to do it while she watched. Either way, the result was the same. 3 nobles, dead. Their bodies thrown overboard. Their ship stripped of anything valuable, then sunk. But Jeanne didn't kill everyone. She spared 1 sailor, a young man, barely 20. She gave him a message. Tell your king, tell him Jeanne de Clisson is coming. Tell him the Lioness remembers. Then she let him go. She wanted him to spread the word. She wanted fear to travel faster than her ships. She wanted every French sailor to see black sails on the horizon and feel their blood turn cold. She didn't just sink French ships. She made sure the survivors remembered her name. Word spread. Faster than Jeanne's ships could sail. By the time her fleet reached the next port, the rumors had already arrived. The woman in black. A ship with crimson sails. French nobles executed without trial. Bodies in the water. Some people thought it was propaganda. English lies meant to demoralize French sailors. Others thought it was a ghost story, the kind of tale sailors tell to pass time during long voyages. But then another ship went missing, and another, and the bodies started washing ashore. French captains began to fear the open water. Merchant ships requested naval escorts. Trade routes were rerouted to avoid areas where Jeanne's fleet had been sighted. Ports sent out warnings. The English Channel, once a busy artery of commerce, became a hunting ground. Jeanne didn't operate randomly. She studied French shipping patterns. She learned which routes were most valuable, which ships carried the most important cargo, which nobles were traveling where. She used spies, merchants, sailors, people loyal to her cause, or simply loyal to gold. Information was a weapon. She wielded it well. Her tactics were efficient. She targeted isolated ships. She struck at dawn or dusk. When visibility was low, she used the weather fog, storms, darkness as cover. She never stayed in one place long enough to be tracked. Her fleet was a ghost, appearing and vanishing like smoke. French naval forces tried to hunt her. King Philip VI issued orders. Find the Black Fleet. Destroy it. Bring Jeanne de Clisson to Paris in chains. He offered rewards, titles, land, gold, anything to stop the woman who was making him look weak. But no one could find her. Or rather, no one who found her survived to report it. Some French ships did engage her. Naval battles in the 14th century were brutal. Arrows flew. Ships rammed each other. Men boarded, fought, died. Jeanne's crew was outnumbered more than once. But they were motivated in a way the French weren't. The French fought for the king. Jeanne's crew fought for revenge. And revenge, it turns out, is a powerful motivator. One by one, French ships disappeared. Sunk, burned, captured. Jeanne left no survivors when it suited her. Other times, she left 1 or 2, just to spread the word, just to make sure the fear kept growing. The king wanted her dead. But first, he had to find her. Jeanne de Clisson wasn't operating in a vacuum. She had allies, unofficial allies, but allies nonetheless. The English crown, locked in the 100 Years' War with France, saw an opportunity. Here was a woman with ships, resources, and a burning hatred for the French king. Why not support her? England didn't officially endorse Jeanne's piracy. That would have violated the fragile rules of medieval warfare, the codes that kept total chaos at bay. But unofficially, England provided her with safe harbors. intelligence, supply. They let her dock in English ports, repair her ships, resupply her crews. They turned a blind eye to her activities, because her activities hurt France. It was a perfect arrangement. Jeanne got logistical support, England got a weapon aimed directly at French shipping, and King Philip VI, already stretched thin fighting English armies on land, now had to worry about his supply lines at sea. The 100 Years' War was fought on multiple fronts: land battles, sieges, political maneuvering. And now, because of Jeanne, the war had a new front: the Atlantic. French merchant ships carrying grain, weapons, gold, anything that kept the war machine running, became targets, and every ship Jeanne sank weakened France just a little more. Some historians argue Jeanne was a privateer, not a pirate. The distinction matters. Pirates operated outside the law, attacking anyone. Privateers had letters of marque, official permission from a government to attack enemy ships. Jeanne never had a formal letter of marque, but she operated with English protection, which amounted to the same thing. She became an asset, a tool. England didn't control her. She was too independent, too driven by personal vengeance to be controlled, but they benefited from her existence. And Jeanne, pragmatic as ever, accepted their support. She needed safe harbors. She needed intelligence. She needed a base of operations. England provided all of that. But alliances in medieval Europe were fragile, built on mutual benefit, not trust. Jeanne understood that. She used England just as much as England used her. If the war ended, if England no longer needed her, she'd be discarded. She knew that. She didn't care. Revenge doesn't think long-term. Revenge thinks now. England didn't condemn her piracy. They funded it. Let's pause. Step away from the blood and the ships and the sinking vessels. Let's ask a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Was Jeanne de Clisson justified? Revenge is one of humanity's oldest instincts. It appears in every culture, every religion, every mythology. An eye for an eye, blood for blood. The idea that wrongs must be balanced, that suffering must be answered with suffering. It feels right, doesn't it? When someone hurts you, when they destroy something you love, the urge to hurt them back isn't just natural, it's primal. But revenge is also dangerous. It doesn't stop. One act of vengeance provokes another. A cycle begins. Blood calls for blood. Families feud for generations. Wars begin over insults, over perceived wrongs, over grudges that no one even remembers the origins of. Revenge doesn't heal, it perpetuates. Medieval Europe understood this. That's why justice systems existed, flawed, corrupt, but existing. Courts, trials, laws. The idea was to replace personal revenge with something more orderly, more controlled. You don't kill someone who wronged you, you bring them to court. You let the law decide. But what happens when the law itself is the problem? What happens when the court that's supposed to deliver justice is the same court that murdered your husband? What happens when the king, the ultimate authority, the person who embodies the law, is the one who betrayed you? Then revenge becomes the only option. Or at least, it feels that way. Jeanne didn't have access to justice. She couldn't sue King Philip VI. She couldn't appeal to a higher power. She couldn't vote him out or protest in the streets. In 14th century France, the king was the law. If he decided you were guilty, you were guilty. If he decided you were a traitor, you were a traitor. There was no appeal, no second opinion, just the end. So Jeanne took the law into her own hands. She became judge, jury, and executioner. She hunted French ships the way the king had hunted her husband. She executed French nobles the way Olivier had been executed. She turned the king's own logic against him. Power makes right. But here's the thing about revenge. It doesn't bring people back. Jeanne knew that. Killing French sailors didn't resurrect Olivier. Sinking ships didn't erase his execution. Revenge doesn't heal the wound. It just gives the wounded something to do with their pain. And yet, for Jeanne, revenge was the only thing that felt real. The only thing that gave her life, purpose, after everything had been taken. She didn't do it because she thought it would make her happy. She did it because the alternative, doing nothing, was unbearable. Revenge is often called hollow, but for Jeanne it was the only thing that felt real. Legends grow in the dark. They thrive in uncertainty, in fear, in the space between what's known and what's imagined. And Jeanne de Clisson, sailing the Atlantic with black ships and crimson sails, became a legend faster than any historian could track. The stories spread. Sailors told them in taverns. Merchants told them in markets. Nobles whispered them in courts. Some stories were true. Some were exaggerations. Some were pure fiction. But all of them served the same purpose. They made Jeanne larger than life. They said she drank the blood of her enemies. That she performed dark rituals on the decks of captured ships. That she was a witch, cursed by God, sailing under the protection of demons. None of that was true. But truth didn't matter. Fear didn't need fact. They said she spared women and children. That she only killed nobles. Only targeted those who served the king. That was closer to the truth. Jeanne wasn't indiscriminate. She had rules. She had targets. But fear doesn't care about nuance. They called her the Crimson Widow, the Lioness, the She-Wolf of Brittany. Each name carried a different flavor of terror. Crimson Widow emphasized the blood, the vengeance, the idea of a woman who had been wronged and was now righting that wrong through violence. Lioness emphasized her ferocity, her predatory nature, the idea that she was a hunter, not prey. She-Wolf emphasized her rage, her maternal fury, the idea that she was protecting something, even if that something was just the memory of her dead husband. The French crown tried to control the narrative. They issued proclamations calling her a pirate, a criminal, a traitor. They reminded people that attacking royal ships was treason, punishable by death. They offered rewards for her capture. But none of it worked. You can't counter a legend with a proclamation. Fear spreads faster than law. English poets wrote ballads about her. Not sympathetic ballads. She was too violent, too vengeful for that. But ballads that acknowledged her as a force of nature, a storm given human form. A reminder that even kings could be vulnerable. French mothers told their children, behave, or the Crimson Widow will come for you. It was absurd. John wasn't targeting children, but fear doesn't need to be rational. It just needs to be effective. Who was the real Jeanne de Clisson? Somewhere between the bloodthirsty demon of French propaganda and the noble avenger of English ballads. She was a woman who had lost everything, a woman who chose war over submission, a woman who understood that in a world ruled by violence, the only way to survive was to become more violent than those who hurt you. History doesn't give us clean heroes. It gives us complicated people doing desperate things in impossible circumstances. Jeanne was that. A person. Not a saint. Not a monster. Just someone who refused to disappear. They called her the Crimson Widow. But who was she really? Avenger, pirate, or something else entirely? War isn't clean. It isn't noble. It's loud and messy. And it smells like blood and shit and burning wood. Jeanne's campaign wasn't an exception. For every French ship she sank, there were sailors who drowned. For every noble she executed, there were families who mourned. War has a cost, always, and someone always pays it. Jeanne's crew wasn't immune. Naval battles in the 14th century were brutal. Men died, not quickly, not heroically. They died from infections after being slashed with rusty swords. They died from gangrene after poorly set broken bones. They died from disease, from malnutrition, from storms that threw them overboard into icy water. Jeanne lost men. Not as many as she killed, but enough. Some of them were mercenaries who signed up for gold. Some were sailors who joined because they believed in her cause. Some were just desperate men with nothing left to lose, who saw Jeanne's Black Fleet as their last chance at something resembling purpose. They died for her, and she moved on, because war doesn't stop for grief. The French sailors she killed weren't all nobles. Most of them were just men trying to survive. Crew members who didn't care about the 100 Years' War, who didn't care about kings or politics. They were just trying to earn enough to feed their families, and then a black ship appeared out of the fog, and their lives ended. They didn't choose to serve the king, they just needed work. Jeanne knew that. She wasn't blind. She wasn't a fanatic. She understood that the people she was killing weren't all guilty, but she did it anyway, because in war, innocence is a luxury. You don't get to sort the guilty from the bystanders. You just fight. You just survive. And the cost wasn't just measured in bodies. It was measured in trauma, in the psychological weight of violence. Jeanne spent years hunting, killing, sinking ships, years watching men die, years ordering executions, years living in a state of constant alertness, constant rage, constant motion. That leaves scars. Not the kind you can see, but the kind that change you. Did she regret it? History doesn't say. Maybe she did. Maybe she lay awake at night on the deck of her ship, staring at the stars, wondering if Olivier would have wanted this. Maybe she didn't. Maybe revenge was enough. Maybe the cost was worth it. But costs are always paid. By someone. Always. Every ship she sank was a victory. But victories in war are measured in blood. King Philip VI was not amused. A woman, a widow, was making him look weak. French ships were disappearing. Nobles were dying. Trade routes were disrupted. And the worst part, he couldn't stop her. He issued orders. Find the Black Fleet. Destroy it. Bring Jeanne de Clisson to Paris in chains. He assigned his best naval commanders to the task. He offered rewards, gold, land, titles, to anyone who could capture her. He sent spies into English ports trying to track her movements. Nothing worked. Jeanne was too smart. Too careful. She never stayed in one place long enough to be trapped. She used fog, storms, and darkness as allies. She struck quickly, then vanished. By the time French naval forces arrived, she was gone, and the only evidence she'd been there at all was wreckage floating on the water. The French Navy tried to set traps. They sent decoy ships, lightly defended vessels meant to lure Jeanne's fleet into ambushes. She saw through them. She had spies of her own, merchants, sailors, people loyal to her cause, or just loyal to gold. She knew which ships were real targets, and which were bait. One French captain, a man named Guillaume de Martel, came close. He tracked Jeanne's fleet to the waters off Normandy. He had 3 ships to her, 3 equal numbers. He thought he had a chance. He was wrong. The battle lasted hours. Ships rammed each other. Arrows flew. Men boarded, fought, bled. Guillaume de Martel was a skilled commander, but Jeanne's crew fought like demons. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They fought until the French ships were burning, sinking, gone. Guillaume de Martel died on his own deck. An arrow through his throat. Jeanne spared one sailor. As always, she sent him back to the king with a message. You'll have to do better than that. The king tried economic warfare. He issued proclamations banning English ports from hosting gin. He threatened sanctions. He tried to pressure England into withdrawing support. England ignored him. The 100 Years' War was still raging. England wasn't going to abandon a useful weapon just because France asked nicely. Philip VI grew desperate. He increased naval patrols. He offered pardons to pirates who would hunt Jeanne. He even considered negotiating sending an envoy to offer her peace. Compensation, anything to make her stop. But his advisors talked him out of it. Negotiating with a traitor would make him look even weaker. So he kept hunting. And she kept evading. Years passed. French shipping adapted. Convoys travelled together, protected by warships. Trade routes shifted to avoid Jeanne's hunting grounds. The Black Fleet's impact lessened, not because Jeanne stopped. She didn't. But because France learned to work around her. But the psychological damage remained. French sailors still feared black sails. Nobles still wondered if they were safe travelling by sea. And King Philip VI still woke up some nights, furious, humiliated, haunted by the woman he couldn't catch. The king sent his best captains to hunt her. None of them ever caught her. Years into her campaign, something unexpected happened. Jeanne remarried. Not to a French noble, not to someone trying to claim her estates. To an English knight. Sir Walter Bentley, a man of military skill, of political connections, of resources. It's easy to read this cynically. A strategic marriage, an alliance built on mutual benefit. Jeanne needed English support. Walter Bentley needed a capable ally with ships and experience. So they married. Simple, practical, cold. But history isn't always that simple. People are complicated, even people driven by revenge. Even people who spend years hunting and killing. Some accounts suggest there was affection, not love, maybe, but respect, mutual understanding. Walter Bentley wasn't trying to control her. He wasn't trying to tame her. or make her stop. He accepted who she was. A woman who had chosen war, who had burned her old life down, and built something new from the ashes. That kind of acceptance is rare, especially in medieval Europe, where women were expected to be submissive, obedient, controllable. Jeanne didn't stop raiding. She didn't hang up her swords and settle into domestic life. The Black Fleet kept hunting. But now she had more resources, more connections, more legitimacy. Walter Bentley gave her access to English military networks, to intelligence, to supplies. The marriage made her stronger. It also complicated her identity. Was she still the Crimson Widow, the vengeful ghost-hunting French ships, or had she become something else? A military asset, a strategic player in the 100 Years' War, maybe both. Maybe the distinction didn't matter. Her children, those who had survived, were grown by now. Some had married, some had estates of their own. They didn't follow their mother's path. They couldn't. The life Jeanne had chosen wasn't one that allowed for family, for normalcy, for peace. She had burned those bridges. Did she regret that? Did she ever wonder what her life would have been like if she'd chosen differently? If she'd remarried quietly after Olivier's death? If she'd raised her children, if she'd let revenge go? History doesn't say. But I doubt it. Jeanne de Clisson wasn't the kind of person who looked back. She remarried, but the Black Fleets never stopped hunting. Here's where the story gets murky. Historical records from this period are incomplete. Documents were lost, destroyed, or simply never written. And Jeanne de Clisson, after years of terrorizing French shipping, began to fade from the records. Some historians say she retired to England, that after her marriage to Walter Bentley, she settled into a quieter life, that she lived in an English manor, far from the sea, spending her final years in relative peace. It's possible. People do change. Rage burns hot, but it doesn't burn forever. Maybe Jeanne reached a point where revenge stopped mattering. Maybe she just got tired. Other historians say she continued raiding until her death, that she never stopped. That the Black Fleet kept hunting French ships well into the 1350s, long after most people assumed she'd given up. That she died at sea, on the deck of her ship, the way warriors are supposed to die in battle, not in bed. Both stories could be true, or neither. History doesn't always give us answers. Sometimes it just gives us fragments, clues, possibilities. What we know for certain: Jeanne de Clisson disappeared from French records around 3056. No execution, no capture, no public trial. She just vanished. Like the fog she used to hide her ships. That disappearance is telling. If the French had captured her, they would have made a spectacle of it. They would have paraded her through Paris. They would have executed her publicly, the way they executed Olivier. The fact that they didn't suggests she was never caught. Maybe she died of old age. Maybe she died of disease. Plague was sweeping through Europe during this period. Maybe she died at sea, and her crew buried her in the water, the way sailors bury their dead. Maybe she faked her death, and lived under a new name. We don't know. And in some ways that's fitting. Jeanne de Clisson was always more legend than person, more ghost than woman. The uncertainty around her death just adds to the myth. She became the sea itself, unpredictable, untamable, impossible to hold. Some stories are better left unfinished. Some people are better left as mysteries. Jeanne is one of them. History doesn't always give us endings. Sometimes it just gives us echoes. Jeanne de Clisson didn't fade after her death. She couldn't. She'd become too large, too mythic. Her story spread through medieval Europe like wildfire, told in taverns and courts, embellished and distorted with each retelling. French mothers warned their children, "Be good, or the lioness will come for you." It was absurd. Jeanne wasn't hunting children, but fear doesn't need accuracy. It just needs momentum. English poets wrote ballads, not flattering ones, necessarily, but ones that acknowledged her as a force, a reminder that even kings could be made to look foolish. That power had limits. That vengeance, once unleashed, was hard to stop. Historians debated her. Was she a pirate? A privateer? A terrorist? A freedom fighter? The answer depended on who was telling the story. To the French, she was a traitor, a criminal, a woman who had stepped outside the bounds of acceptable behavior. To the English, She was useful. To later feminists, she was a symbol, a woman who refused to be victimized, who took power into her own hands. But symbols are dangerous. They flatten people. They erase complexity. Jeanne de Clisson wasn't a hero. She killed people. A lot of people. Some of them deserved it. Some of them didn't. She was driven by rage, not justice. She didn't fight for freedom or equality. She fought for revenge. And yet, her story resonates. Because it's a story about what happens when the systems meant to protect you fail, when the law becomes lawless, when justice becomes a joke. What do you do then? Jeanne's answer was clear. You fight back. You refuse to disappear. You become ungovernable. That's why her story survives. Not because she was good, not because she was right, but because she refused to be erased. Centuries later, during the French Revolution, rebels invoked her name, woman who had defied a king, who had taken up arms against tyranny, who had refused to bow. They didn't care that she was a noble woman, that she'd fought for personal revenge rather than political ideals. They just cared that she'd fought. In the 20th century, she appeared in novels, in histories, in feminist retellings. Each generation found something different in her story. Each generation shaped her to fit their needs. That's what legends do. They adapt. They survive. Jeanne de Clisson, the woman, died sometime in the 14th century, but the lioness, the legend, never did. She became a legend. And legends, unlike people, never truly die. Let's step out of the 14th century for a moment. Let's ask, why does Jeanne de Clisson's story still matter? We don't live in a world of medieval kings and naval warfare. We don't execute traitors in public squares. We don't paint ships black and hunt our enemies across the Atlantic. And yet, the emotions Jeanne carried, the grief, the rage, the hunger for justice in a world that offers none, those haven't changed. People still feel betrayed by governments, by institutions, by systems that promise fairness and deliver cruelty. People still watch loved ones destroyed by forces beyond their control, not execution's axes, but poverty, illness, systemic injustice. And people still ask, what do I do with this rage? Where does it go? Jeanne's answer, violence, revenge, total war, isn't one most of us can follow. We live in societies with laws, with consequences. We can't just buy ships and start hunting our enemies. But the impulse is the same. The desire to strike back, to refuse victimhood, to become ungovernable. Modern activists understand this. When legal systems fail, when peaceful protest is ignored, when justice is denied, people radicalize. They move from reform to resistance, from asking nicely to demanding loudly, from hope to rage. Jeanne de Clisson is an early example of that trajectory. A person who tried the legal route, found it useless, and chose another path. She's also a reminder of the cost. Revenge consumed her. It gave her purpose, but it also took everything else. She lost her children, her home, her identity as anything other than the lioness. She became the thing she hunted, a predator, defined entirely by violence. Is that a cautionary tale? Maybe. Or maybe it's just reality. Maybe some injustices are so large, so personal, that they can't be answered with patience or forgiveness. Maybe some people are broken in ways that can't be healed, only expressed. Jeanne de Clisson doesn't give us answers. She just gives us a mirror. And what we see in that mirror depends on who we are, what we've lost, and how far we're willing to go to get it back. Her world was different from ours, but the feelings she carried, betrayal, rage, the need for justice, that hasn't changed. The woman stands on the deck of a black ship. The wind pulls at her hair. The ocean stretches endlessly ahead, dark and cold. She's hunting, always hunting, because stopping would mean facing the silence, the grief, the question she spent years avoiding. Was it worth it? Jeanne de Clisson sailed into legend. Her story became myth. Her name became a warning. But the woman herself, the person beneath the armor, beneath the rage, faded. History remembers the lioness. It forgets Jeanne. Maybe that's what she wanted. Maybe becoming a legend was easier than staying human. Humans mourn. Humans regret. Humans ask whether the cost was worth it. Legends don't. Legends just are. We don't know how Jeanne died. We don't know if she found peace. We don't know if in her final moments she thought of Olivier, of her children, of the life she burned down. We don't know if she felt vindicated or empty, triumphant or hollow. History doesn't give us those answers. It just gives us the outline. A woman, a betrayal, a fleet, a hunt, and then silence. But silence isn't the end. Stories like Jeanne's don't end. They echo, they resurface, they find new audiences, new meanings, new relevance. Because vengeance, grief, and the refusal to disappear, those are universal. They transcend time, place, culture. Jeanne de Clisson wasn't a hero. She wasn't a villain. She was a person who faced an impossible choice and chose war. She was a reminder that even the powerless can become dangerous, that even kings should fear the consequences of betrayal. That rage, once unleashed, is hard to contain. She sailed into legend, and legends, like the sea, never truly rest. If you'd like to wander deeper into the forgotten corners of history, where women became legends and vengeance became sail and storm, subscribe before the next story fades into the mist. The past whispers, but only to those who listen.